Today's tutorial is going to be a little watercolor on a 6x6 piece of paper, Arches 300-pound watercolor paper. I'm doing a little scene on a river with trees in the background, and I'm working in the background here with a light wash. The paper is wet on both sides. I've soaked the paper with a spray, and I'm using ultramarine cobalt for the basic wash of the background cloud area and the waterway just to start out. I do go into olive green and a little phthalo yellow green to give the outline basically of my tree line in the background. I start just basically laying out the design of my piece with all wet on wet, and then we'll slowly start working drier with each level I go. As you see here, I'm trying to manipulate the sky a little bit. There was a little running from the wet on wet, and now I'm just trying to control that a little bit with my small fan brush. And you can see on the left side there's some dripping going on, which is what happens with watercolor, and I just start removing the excess I don't want. But basically in the beginning, you're doing all wet on this piece and then coming back in and building up. I'm going to try to finish the cloud area as best I can and then start working in the foreground. The whole premise of this piece is wet on wet, and you'll see as I go that the paper keeps a little glisten to it that shows that I'm trying to maintain that wet on wet look with a little bit of control, working with the olive green and the phthalo green, yellow green for my trees for now, with a tiny touch of Payne's gray and tiny bit of alizarin crimson in there too. Sometimes that just neutralizes it a little bit with the alizarin crimson. Now you see I'm letting the paints run a little bit in my background trees. I want that purposely because I do have some shadows that are going to be happening there. This Payne's gray and alizarin crimson are what I'm using now for the shadows in the water. Again, this is just the basic outline of the piece, gives me the design in paint so I can move forward. I did do a light pencil sketch, which is hard to see because I do it so light. Got to be careful with lead and watercolor paper. Sometimes it's hard to remove after you've painted over some of it if it shows through. Coming in with Payne's gray here to start working the shadows. A little bit drier, but you can see the glistening of the paper still showing that I'm working wetter than more wet than dry, but giving a sense of where my light is coming already. To me, this image, the sun is coming from kind of behind the trees, and I keep that in mind with my shadows in the water, so that it's really the sun's up high in the back, and I want to pay attention to that as I'm doing my trees and the shadows in the water. So now I'm just working a little bit drier. It's not running as much, so now I'm getting a little more control. I'm going to leave the sky alone. I'm happy with that just like it is, keeping this loose feeling. And as you see through the whole piece, I'm constantly manipulating the paints, coming in with that olive green and phthalo yellow green, again, working between the trees and the grasses. trying to give a little more rigid edges to the trees so they don't look too artificial there. That olive green with just a touch of Payne's gray is a nice combination. Now I went in with the alizarin crimson, tiny bit with the Payne's, and that gives a really nice jet black. And again, it's how I'm working the amount of water in my paints too. That opaque cream I use with the phthalo green, yellow green, is what I'm using to try to get some highlights in my grasses and the trees. And again, I'll blend them as I go. I've told you before, if you've watched my other videos, that I have a hard time removing any of the paints from my palettes because I feel like I can always use even the muddy spots. I come in handy. So I see some other artists who just wipe out their palettes and keep them nice and clean, and I just can't seem to get rid of the paints. I find them all useful at some point. And then I'm going to be having to come into the waterway here and eventually work on the shadows and bring in more of the blues. I've kept the initial wash of the water, the little riverbed, as it is, and that will be my highlight, and I'll just come in with some shadows after, finishing up the background on the trees with going between the greens and the Payne's gray for the shadow effect and the highlight. Here I am going in with a ultramarine blue and a little bit of Payne's gray to do the initial shadow mark. Just wisping it around, giving it, jagged edges. Going in with the ultramarine and the a little bit of Payne's, and just coming down and kind of grounding the riverbed. Coming in with some straight ultramarine there. And it's coming along. I'm liking how it's staying loose, and the waterway kind of playful with the way the water ran and with the pigment. Notice how the initial wash of the riverbed turns out to be a nice highlight. Now I'm coming in with just straight cobalt blue for a little extra interest. And now I'm just fanning it out. Taking that little mini fan brush and taking that opaque cream and putting it into my tree line, and then I'll come back and just fan it out a little bit so it looks a little more blended. Yep, coming in with the same opaque into the grasses, and I'll fan that out again, constantly moving the paints around till I'm satisfied. And then I'll have to give a little direction for the grasses as well, and fan that opaque out just a little bit. I don't want it to be as rigid lines as it looks right there, especially in that center left. Needs to be fanned out right there. Well, thank you for watching this little tutorial. If you like what I'm doing, like and subscribe, and pick up a paintbrush and paint. And I'll see you in the next painting. I appreciate you watching, and you have a great day.